Today is a day for celebration, as Paul reminded us that we are entering into the high holy days of the church. It's June, so it's officially Pride Month, and it's Pentecost, which celebrates the movement of the Spirit and marks the birth of the church. I'm celebrating today because it's the one-year anniversary of my own ordination as a minister in metropolitan community churches. It's also almost the one-year anniversary of my time here as a pastoral leader. So this is a day to celebrate. A day to celebrate the Spirit and the way she moves through and in each of us. A day to celebrate the gifts bestowed on each of us. A day to celebrate the church at large and this church gathered here this evening. It's a time for me to celebrate all the many ways that the Spirit has moved in order to get me here, to where I am today. Both of our readings tonight talk about the bestowal and the diversity of gifts. They are stories about the way the Spirit moves in and through people and allows people to move in the world in different ways, and allows people to reach others in different ways. The first story is told by Luke in the book of Acts, one that Wes reminded me this week we read every year on Pentecost. And Wes reminded me of this because he has the gift of crafting wonderful worship services. He also has the gift of reminding the pastoral leader when she procrastinates and doesn't give her information to him on time. In this scripture that we read every year on Pentecost, we learn of the way the Spirit descended in flaming tongues. One tongue landing on each of the disciples, and then the disciples were able to speak in different languages and could communicate with people who spoke their own language. When I think about gifts and flaming tongues and the movement of the Spirit, I, of course, think of sex. But I understand the gift of languages is also important. It enabled disciples to communicate with other people in a really important way. Yesterday I watched Wonder Woman, and her ability to speak hundreds of languages also helped her to save the world. So language is really important, and the way we communicate is important. But there's tremendous diversity in the gifts bestowed on each of us. Our second reading this evening comes from 1 Corinthians. It talks about the diversity of gifts that each of us possesses. Gifts as diverse as the body. Gifts of wise counsel, clear understanding, simple trust, healing the sick, miraculous acts, proclamation, distinguishing between spirits, tongues, interpretation of tongues, and the many, many other gifts. The gift of leading the congregation in song, the gift of challenging the congregation to fight for justice, the gift of prayerfully considering all that is happening in the world, the gift of interpreting Scripture. We all use our many gifts to reach people in different ways and to build community in different ways, to build a church where this diversity is celebrated. My gift is not in giving bulletin information in a timely manner, nor is it in leading the congregation in song, but something that I am able to do is tell stories. So tonight I'm going to do that and tell some stories. Last week I was in a meeting of a group of folks from another denomination, and when I was in this meeting I was talking about my call to ministry, and I started that story saying something about how I was anti-establishment and anti-institutional, and as I was telling this story I wish that I could pull my words back because I remembered that I was not in a room full of folks who were MCC. Out loud I was trash-talking institutions and I was trash-talking the church. And in my head, I was screaming at myself to stop because these weren't leaders of the Metropolitan Community Church, and not everyone might be as excited about my whole self. But fortunately for me, there is an MCC. There's an MCC that celebrates the diversity of people and the diversity of their many gifts. There is an MCC that grew from one person's living room to a global denomination because it is what the world needed. And those who had the gifts of building it let the Spirit move and followed to suit that need. It is likely that most of you have heard this story, probably more than once, but I'm going to tell it again because it's a good one. And because this is a story about all that we are celebrating today, the movement of the Spirit, pride, my own ordination, all tied into this denomination. In 1968, a young Troy Perry broke up with his boyfriend. When his boyfriend told him that their relationship was over, Perry felt a great sense of despair. And in those desperate and helpless moments, he turned to suicide. Fortunately, Perry survived this suicide attempt, and in the wake of it was able to reconnect with God. While he was in the hospital waiting room, through a gift of kindness from a stranger, Perry was reminded that people care and that God is there. Following these events, and in the midst of heinous acts against LGBTQ people in the United States, Perry started a movement. With the gift of support and encouragement from his friends, Perry followed where the Spirit led and gathered together with a small group in his home to start a new church. This was a church for the outcast, broken down, beat up people who were told there was no home for them in Christianity. Those who were told that they were sinful by their very act of being. But fortunately, for those who started to gather together, Perry had the gift of prophecy. He had the gift of preaching, he had the gift of leading, and he had the gift of not backing down in the face of adversity. He had the gift of following God where and how he was called. Perry's first sermon that evening, gathered together in his living room, was titled, "Be True to You," and he called on those gathered to be true to themselves. This is a message that has carried throughout the history of our denomination. That small group of people gathered in Perry's living room that first night grew and grew. Soon larger space was needed. The church grew and the wider movement for LGBT inclusion grew, though in the early days that fight was mostly focused on gay and lesbian issues, but that is a story for another time. The church and the fight for LGBTQ inclusion, equality, and safety were growing and inexplicably intertwined. This denomination was founded at the intersection of sexuality, spirituality, and justice, and it soon became a home for people from many backgrounds, as it was the first and only church to fully include and celebrate people from the LGBTQ community. There were and are struggles on how to best do this. Some folks are more comfortable with mirroring mainline Protestant denominations. Others are more comfortable with celebrating the more radical aspects of themselves. I appreciate the value in both approaches, as they both have their place, though I know that I, by my very existence and by my ministry, need very much the gift of the radical embrace of MCC. The MCC that celebrates all of who I am when I am being true to myself. Just as Perry called for during that first worship service. The first worship service that bore many more and spread across the country and around the world, leading the way for new generations so that when I discovered MCC, I was welcomed by the gift of radical acceptance and inclusion. All the work that everyone did before me paved the way for me to be true to me. In MCC, I found the gift of love and acceptance that is often lacking in religious communities for persons like me. When I was discerning a call to ministry, the gift of guidance by others helped to orient me in the direction of my call. The gift of this denomination loved me into being. The gift of this denomination has loved many people into being. So many people who are not fully loved in all spaces. From folks who I have found at MCC, I have heard people say, "This is the first time I have ever been welcome in church. And this is the first place I've ever been comfortable being myself." I have generally felt very comfortable being myself, but it can be difficult to feel loved outside of community, and so I was happy to find a Christian community that let me be my whole, full, peculiar self without question. MCC is where I first felt welcome in a religious space. It is where I found community. It is where I found home. It is where I found family. It is where I found a place that I could question, that I could struggle, that I could be flawed, and that I could be human. It is where I found a place to celebrate all the parts that others had called sinful. Where I found affirmation that it is okay to be me, and it is okay to be me in a world that tells me that it is not. MCC is where I felt the Spirit move. Where I found the Spirit alive and at work for those who most need to feel her presence and her work in this world. MCC has a gift of loving people fully, has a history of making every day feel like Pride. We don't wait until June. This has helped shape me into the person and the minister that I am today. Someone who learned that this is an institution that has room for people who don't like institutions. Something that may only make sense through experience. Someone who learned that when preaching about Pentecost, I can talk about how flaming tongues make me think of sex. The experiences that helped me to know that someone like me can be a minister. There are not many denominations who would welcome into the pulpit an openly queer, poly person with a mohawk, tattoos, and who refuses to wear anything other than skinny jeans in the pulpit. But from the first time I sat in an MCC church, through all the people who have encouraged me along the way, and those who supported me on my winding journey to ordination, I have felt the Spirit move. The Spirit is alive in MCC and moves in and around and through this church. And she's just as queer as those living into the call to celebrate their full selves. I have felt the Spirit move in MCC the way I felt the Spirit move so strongly for me 1 year ago, when I knelt on the earth in the wet grass under a tent, and my family, church chosen and of origin, laid their hands on me and prayed, and prayed, and prayed, and affirmed my call to ministry, my call to serve this radical, open, and loving denomination. Through their prayer and affirmation, the movement of the Spirit was palpable, and I knew without question that MCC was the place for me. I've never felt such great affirmation of my call, of who I was, and of the ministry to which I'm called, with those on the margins, the radical outcasts that MCC loves into being. MCC is made up with people of so many different gifts, all contributing to the gift of MCC in the world, moved by the Spirit to celebrate those gifts in the fullness of all people. So thank you, MCC, for the gift of you. Amen.